So here at the Lurie Institute, we're committed to research and policy that center the voices, the experiences, and the rights of disabled people. And a really important and a critical part of our work is grappling with the history that has shaped the systems that we live in today. And a history that's often painful, it's often uncomfortable, but it is essential to confront if we are to build a future rooted in justice and equity. So today's book talk brings us face to face with that history. We are privileged to welcome Alex Green, who will be giving a talk titled The Role of Disability History in Transforming Approaches to Disability Policy, Advocacy, Justice, and Rights. And Alex is the author of an extraordinary book where he explores the life of Walter E. Fernald, the founding of the Fernald School right here in Waltham, and the broader systems of institutionalization and eugenics that devastated and continue to devastate the lives of countless disabled people across generations. So when I first read A Perfect Turmoil, Alex, I want to tell you, I found myself highlighting and underlining more passages than I have since graduate school. I sat with a deep sense of grief, of anger, and also clarity, because this history is not distant and it's not over. The systems that were built in Fernald's time, segregation, devaluation, and control, still shape the lives of disabled people today. And at this very moment, we are living at a time when the rights of disabled people are again under attack. Threats to Medicaid, challenges to the ADA, and the renewed pushes towards in mass institutionalization. And that's what makes A Perfect Turmoil so urgent. It gives us the tools to understand how these systems were built, how they were justified, and eventually resisted. So here we have Alex. Alex is a writer, advocate, historian, and a scholar who occupies a vital space in disability policy in Massachusetts. He authored the landmark legislation creating the first disability-led human rights commission to investigate the state's institutional history. Alex, we are very grateful for your work and your insistence that history demands action. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Alex Green.
Well, thank you. Can you all hear me through this? Is that, or should I also use this microphone or just one or both? Yes, I'll move this thing up a little bit. There we go. All right, excellent. Tell me if that goes at any point. Thank you all for coming, and Monica, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. Though I hope it was more readable than at least half of what you had to do in graduate school. It's to those of you online as well, thank you for coming. And my associations with Brandeis are particularly important to this work, I think, to the connections, I think, to the Fernald School and to institutionalization around the country and the history of disability around the country and disability policy. I had no idea about any of that when I came here as an undergraduate 25 years ago now, but I cherish my affiliations with the school to this day because it prepared me to do the work that this took to be able to reveal this story and to draw these connections, and gave me the skills to be able to do that. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today is the process of unearthing a history that is not often told, and is not known enough, in a world where I never could have prepared for how urgent the lessons and call would be for these connections to be seen and understood, so that we can protect the rights and lives of people today and also go farther, especially when they're under attack. So we have about an hour together, and I want to take about half of that time to talk about the research process that went into this and what this book is about, and the person at the heart of it. And then I'd like to leave the other half of our time together for questions, because I think that this material often raises great questions. And selfishly, after 10 years of work, I love hearing how other people process and think about this material. And I always wanted this to be an accessible book. My vision is, you'll see that Walter Fernald was really the creator of special education as we know it today. I always felt that someone who went through special education is owed answers, and that I was trying to write a book that they would be able to access and read and understand, and it would give them empowerment to know why the system that they went through was the system that it was, or is the system that it is. Handful of things. First, just to describe myself for anyone with any visual impairments, I am a very tall, gangly, brown-haired, bearded, and way too winterized individual, so I'm very pale. Today, I'm going to share some images that are pretty unsettling, and I'm sorry for that, and you should feel free to step away at any point if those shock you, and they are shocking. My language is going to be pretty harsh, because the language of disability over time, as many of you know, has been pretty harsh. And also in question and answer, to those of you online and here, your language in asking questions does not have to be perfect. One of the things that I've learned in this work is that going back far in history, people have wrestled with terms around disability because they are so imperfect and they become so dated so quickly. And I know that it's very hard to know what the right terms are for things and why the choices are what they are behind how we use them. So please ask your questions, and I may reframe them around language that we use today as a way to start to understand that. So those are kind of some parameters for diving in. So I want to start where most people are in American society these days. And I think through much of our history, which is, we know what asylums were. We know what asylums are. There are still asylums. We give them different names now, but we have a good, deep cultural understanding of the premise of asylums, even if we do not necessarily cut into them when it comes to rights the way that we might want to. And that's largely because of popular culture and because they fill a place as horror stories for us. And so you can see here two very good examples, right? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson, and American Horror Story, much more recent sort of thing, set in an asylum. But that is masked a history as much as it tells us anything. And the history that it has masked is of a similar and related group of institutions, but that actually have a very distinct history. And those are what were called the state schools, and today are called the state developmental centers where they exist. This is an attempt by some of us to map where they are. Actually, an awesome map came out this week from the University of Texas at Austin that maps all of them and the asylums. But you can see on the northeast here, that aggregation of blue dots tells you just how much New England was invested in institutional systems, asylums and state schools. And the state schools have a very different trajectory than asylums do, though many of the founders of these movements knew each other well and certainly shared ideas. Asylums were really created as hospitals, as spaces for some kind of improvement relating to mental illness. And despite what we might think about the trajectory of history, going back to the colonial period in the United States, people, or the pre-United States, I guess, people understood a difference between mental illness and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And if you look at the early colonial charter, there's different language around these things. They knew that there were differences in these things. What that meant is that in the mid-1800s, when people were building out big reform systems and starting to say, how do we make a better country and build out a government that serves its people, there were different trajectories that people ran with for different disabilities. With mental illness, Dorothea Dix in Massachusetts really pushed expanding asylums as a relief for getting people out of almshouses and local, really torturous poorhouses, conditions like that. But her colleague, Samuel Gridley Howe, who was kind of a swashbuckling figure, though not so decrepit as in his older years, in his younger years, was a doctor and was a reformer in Massachusetts. And he was the director of the Perkins School for the Blind, which started opening in the late 1820s into the early 1830s. And Howe has kind of a remarkable history. He's a really radical revolutionary individual. He's a vehement evangelical kind of Christian for his era as a reformer. He believes that we're living in sin in various ways and that God is going to come down soon and it's going to be bad for us. One of the big areas that he's really a fighter against is slavery. And so he becomes later on in his life one of the Secret Six who were running guns to John Brown. He's a pretty swashbuckling character. We now know his wife a lot more, Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic for the Union Army. But Howe's heart was in a specific area. He started observing in the late 1830s students who were coming to him who also had intellectual and developmental disabilities. And he started asking around saying, okay, they're blind and they have these other things. Does anyone try to teach these folks? And nobody could really give him a straight answer. And so he started digging around. He found some examples in France. That was kind of the best example he could find, one place. And he went out and did a census. This is very big if you think of today about registration of people with intellectual disabilities being asked for by the federal government. He said, we need to know where all of the intellectually disabled people are. In the harsh term of the time, where are all of the idiots? And he did a census to locate everybody in Massachusetts. And he found that while people were downplaying how many people were out there, actually there were a lot of people out there with intellectual disabilities. And he made a claim based on what his friend Horace Mann was doing, which was to expand public education around the country, and especially starting in Massachusetts. And he said they deserve a public education as well. People with intellectual disabilities deserve a public education. And here's the radical claim for its day and age: they can learn, which in that era shocked the hell out of people. And many of them mocked him. But he was powerful, and he got some funding to locate a temporary experimental school within the Perkins School to start teaching pupils who he felt, if they got an education, could go through his school for a year and go home with skills where they could learn things and where they could actually support their families. If you think about that era, to have an intellectually disabled child is actually a very significant threat on a family's independence. Industrialization put enormous pressures on people, and Howe was very aware of that and of the disabling effects of industrialization. He's trying to alleviate that. And that becomes something called the Massachusetts School for, I think, educating originally idiotic and feeble-minded youth. And that's the roots of what is later called the Fernald School. Some people know this story, and then we leap ahead and people know this story. And this is what the Fernald State School became, the school that originally was started by Howe. On the left, you can see from the early 1990s, right around Christmas of 93, I think, it was revealed that there were radiation experiments done on inmates of the Fernald School in the 1950s. And I'll use the word inmates throughout this because I believe right up to the 1970s, certainly the 50s and 60s, the widely used term on forms like the census for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in large institutions was inmate. They were seen as inmates, not as pupils, not as students, not as patients, but as inmates. It was known for these radiation experiments, which sparked presidential intervention, a presidential commission, and a presidential apology from Bill Clinton. And by then, the conditions that the Fernald School was known for were known widely around the country, as were most of these state schools. This is a boy tied to the bench in the 1960s, a couple of gentlemen sitting on the bare floor of a building. This became a massive 196-acre prison of sorts. And the nation by then was very, very wedded to these systems. Many of us know some of these stories: the Willowbrook story, Pennhurst, lawsuits, attempts to shut these down that led to group homes and some community living, though plenty of these places still exist all over the place, albeit smaller, and including here in Massachusetts. But what was not known when I started asking people was this story in between. I kept asking people, well, who the hell was Walter Fernald? And nobody could give me an answer. And I thought, this is an institution that was the first of its kind in North America. It spawned hundreds of others, and no one can tell me who Walter Fernald is. All I could find was a repeated myth over and over again that he was a relatively inconsequential institutional manager and propagandist, that he was a rigid and cruel eugenicist, that he was a big proponent of sterilization and intelligence testing, and that right before he died, he had this sudden about face and changed all of his opinions. And as someone who likes history, I think that's crap right away. You see a story like that and you think to yourself, very few times in people's lives and in our history do we see someone have a very sudden about face. And so I got curious about what was going on in this history, and I decided to start digging. And what that led me to was this article here, which really stopped me cold. It's from 1924 when Fernald died. It's from the Boston Globe, and it's the governor ordering the flags to be lowered to half staff in Massachusetts when Fernald died. And I thought to myself, okay, I don't know a lot about this guy, but I know that he was a doctor and an institution manager and an educator and all those things. I have never seen in my lifetime a governor order flags flown at half staff, let alone that they would say, no one has ever served the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with greater devotion or distinction than. Who the hell was this guy? But when I asked around, everybody said all the records from the Fernald School had been destroyed. It closed in 2014. I helped the city of Waltham buy that property. There were certainly records all over the place in the buildings, but no discernible history. And I knew that when it closed, it had the largest library on intellectual and developmental disabilities in the world in it. I knew that the books had come to Brandeis, but I did not know where the records were. So I went to State Archives and I asked a very naive question to the archivist, and I said, I doubt you have anything. Everybody said it's all been destroyed, but do you have any, like even a box of materials by Walter Fernald? And she looked at me like an alien and said, we have 65 boxes of materials by Walter Fernald alone, let alone the whole institution, which is hundreds. But here's the catch. Medical records are sealed in perpetuity in Massachusetts. So anyone who wants to look at them, we have to read the pages first, and we have to redact them by blacking out names on photocopies before you can see them, which slows the process down enormously. And to add to the fun, I should also tell you that every single page of this work is completely out of chronological order, that photograph on the far right. What that means is that you will open a box, and she was right, you'll find a letter from 1887, and the next will be from 1905, and the next will be from 1924, the next will be from 1895, and you're just going to go through this when you look. So how about we start small, and you take a look at one box? So I agreed to that. I said, all right, that's very kind of you to do. I will take a look at one box. And what I found in that box was, along with photographs next to it, was much more akin to what these images represent. These are photographs from inside the Fernald School in the 1890s. That's Walter Fernald at the center. And those are architectural plans for the school when he moved it out of a decrepit facility in Boston that he found when he came there in 1887, a young doctor. And I looked at these and thought, okay, in disability communities, and I am disabled, and I've heard plenty of stories, and I've been institutionalized before, I heard that these places were like concentration camps. And this does not look like the work of someone who is out to kill the people who live in his institution. So something is off here, because this is not a concentration camp. You don't go to all this effort to propagandize this way. There's no, everything about this suggests that we're missing some key part of this story. And I asked for a horrible question, which is, can I see all the boxes? And they said, we can start going through them very, very slowly. And so for 5 years, from about 2015 to 2020-ish, I rolled with that, and the archives graciously, at no fee, because archivists are awesome, pre-read everything in their spare time, every moment that they had, and made everything that they could available to me. And still, by the end of 5 years, I'd gone through about 10 boxes. 15 boxes, and we sat down and did the math. And I mean, there's onion skin paper in here, so one box alone could have 10,000 pages of material in it. Overall, it's 250,000 documents or more, and so I said, let's do the math on this, and I realized it's going to take 47 years for me to finish this, and as much as I love this work, I am no. So I said, no, I'm not doing that. And we started to try to find workarounds to make something possible where I could get access to these records. And nothing was workable. The state would not budge. The archives was trying in every way. And I was sitting in the driveway on a phone call with some of the archive staff who've now retired or left. And I said, I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do. I think I may just have to abandon this work. I really have no idea what's left. We've tried everything. And someone on the call who's senior and knowledgeable, after a long pause, said, well, one thing that could happen is that someone in a situation similar to yours could sue us. I'm not saying that that has to happen, but someone could sue us. And I said, oh, really? And they said it might get people to act more quickly above us. So thankfully, I have some colleagues who are very crafty, and they went out and found me WilmerHale, the large law firm that many are reading about today. And WilmerHale gave me 3 lawyers pro bono who drafted a complaint and went to the state and said, you have 3 options. We can sue you, and you will lose because you're misreading the public records law. Or you can come into court and say, we support this guy, let him do his work, or you can just let him do the work right now. And they told me to expect that when they sent this complaint to the archives, or to the Secretary of State's office, that they would probably do a brief meeting and then go to court. And instead they called and they said, we will give you the entire archive staff to help do this work until it is all redacted, which is why my dear friend who's now working in the United Arab Emirates has that look on his face at me while I'm taking a photo of him in the archives. Not happy about it, but they did it. And ultimately, they came up with an even better agreement, which is all of these boxes were moved over to the Department of Developmental Services about 2 years ago. They gave me an office on a floor with lawyers. They had me sign an NDA. They surrounded me. And I was able to ask questions about what I could document and what I couldn't, but I was able to go through all of these documents and begin to piece together the story of Walter Fernald. And that story is very different than what we knew. And it reshapes a fundamental understanding of intellectual and developmental disabilities in the 20th century and up through today, because Walter Fernald was quietly at the center of everything. He was the person you had to go to for any information, which is why he had the largest library in the world. If you wanted to do anything in this field, you had to go through him because he knew everyone and everything. And what I found just by example here are some of the things in the archives that really caught my eye. This is a letter on the top left from John Dewey, a little card, the famous educator, kind of creator of modern educational systems as we know them, asking for Fernald's books for his library. Below that, we have a letter from John Harvey Kellogg from Kellogg's Corn Flakes, the famous eugenicist, asking a very odd question about intellectually disabled people and how they go to the bathroom. Sure. A full-page advertisement in the Springfield Union asking for an institution like Fernald's. A letter in the middle from William James, America's first psychology professor, asking if he can keep bringing his experimental psychology students out to Fernald's school to study. A card from Booker T. Washington asking for reports from Fernald's school to learn his educational methods, and a postcard from Japan proudly sharing after their visit with him how they were building out their institutions. Man influenced everything that everybody did. And through his life, he sort of followed an arc. And that arc is that he started off as something of a utopian. And he decided that where intellectually disabled kids were reviled, generally in society, that he was going to build a utopia to protect them from a very hateful world. And then eugenics came along, and it fit right at a perfect moment for Fernald, where he was able to make an enormous amount of sense, he thought, out of what he was doing by using eugenic ideas to think about disability. And he became not just a person influenced by eugenics, but a very large influencer of the shaping of eugenics in America. And then he has this very strange turnabout later on in his career that lasted a lot longer than one instant, that actually was a large, years-long project where he broke with eugenicists and actually became their biggest detractor, leading the very first case, successful legal case in American history against forced sterilization, and disproving his own work as a method of showing that people who got out of his institution were actually leading very good lives, and really ends his life saying, my institution should be scaled down to almost nothing. and we shouldn't have institutions like these. After having spent my life telling all of you to build them all over the world and done it very successfully, we need good communities. And we've spent the last 10 years, 20 years, chasing down disabled people as though one expression of their disability is that they are criminals. And I've helped build that myth, and that has to go away. What we actually need to monitor is communities that are bad to their disabled people. And then he dies. And that's kind of the overarching legacy, which then shifts that myth that I started with into something much more complex. He was a world-renowned institution builder, policymaker, and propagandist. He created special education as we know it today in the public schools in Providence, Rhode Island. He was widely seen as the Montessori of America, Maria Montessori's educational methods, to such an extent that her first book in English, in the foreword to it, it says, "This woman is great, but I should tell you that Walter Fernald's doing this right down the road in Waltham, and he's been doing it for decades, if you want to see it at work." He also really hated Montessori. He was a rigid and cruel eugenicist at points, but he was a vehement opponent of sterilization, and originally a very big opponent of intelligence testing, which is wild because he's the progenitor of the word moron that Henry Goddard creates using the IQ test. He's a founding faculty member of the Harvard Graduate School of Education and actually is the mentor to the first woman to get a doctorate from Harvard. He's incredibly progressive about certain areas of women's rights and elevating women in the workplace as doctors around him at the same time that he persecutes disabled women, which is a very conflicting legacy. And his effort was years long to try to dismantle the system that he saw building up around him. It's a very, very, very different sort of thing than what I think I went into this expecting. So that's an overview of a very, very large swath of history. I want to make sure that I have time for questions, but what I'd like to do for a moment is actually read, because this is in Waltham and we're all here, and I think seeing the connections to today are important. I want to just read actually, and this, I don't think it's the worst authorial thing to do, but I'm going to read from the end of the book, where we come up to the present day. And in between, you can find out all about Walter and how this all kind of became what it was. I think in this very urgent moment that we're experiencing, it may be helpful to kind of see where ideologically this brought me to in this work. In 2014, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts sold the grounds of the Fernald Developmental Center to the city of Waltham for $3.7 million in an agreement intended to ensure historic preservation and the restoration of the natural environment that had drawn Walter Fernald and all of these other folks to the land in 1887. By the winter of 2015, the grounds were abandoned. For the first time since the 19th century, every single part of the place that had played a central role in shaping our notions of intelligence, disability, education, medicine, community, and the state sat empty. But in Walter Fernald's library, in the offices, attics, and basements of the buildings that he painstakingly designed, there was evidence of a story that predated the one that was commonly known. Fused to the place was the story of Walter Fernald, the man, whose life had been reduced to a caricature. In part, this was the fault of post-war scholars who could not believe that an institutional superintendent could have had such an impact. Instead, they portrayed him as a one-time monster who'd had a change of heart, an incidental figure in a history about more important figures. They mined his speeches for unsettling quotes rather than reading them as the words of an adept political figure whose writings should be treated as a highly nuanced, carefully crafted statements that have deep and lasting resonance today. In 1984, a group of historians led by Michael Sokol urged researchers studying the field of intelligence testing to do more primary source research. Sokol warned that in the absence of such research, policymakers were making uninformed, poor decisions based on prejudice rather than fact. This remains relatively unchanged today and has impacted non-historians who have been deprived of any substantive understanding of figures like Fernald and have escaped a much-needed reckoning with the currents between past and present as a result. I'm going to jump just farther to the end. We have, and Fernald ends his career talking about something called the legend of the feeble-minded, that they built up as a stereotype about disabled people that was in the way of kind treatment and a caring society. I wrote at the end, we have our own legend of the feeble-minded, which can be found in the mass-produced stories about institutions that abound today. In those stories, non-disabled people find themselves unjustly trapped inside institutions. We are encouraged to feel shock and outrage at the fact that people who fit our definition of normal could be so brutally victimized. Each in its own way, these stories encourage us to believe that the problem with how we treat the disabled is the fact that non-disabled people might accidentally get treated that way too. In many ways, at face value, we have today the utopia Walter Fernald envisioned. Intellectually and cognitively disabled people register with a state agency that coordinates services for them and is responsible for ensuring that providers comply. Special education classes are at the center of a disabled child's network of care, and various forms of social support surround them. But it seems difficult to believe that Walter Fernald would be anything but disappointed in the fact that it has taken so long to get to what amounts to an underfunded and scorned implementation of ideas from 1924. Fernald wronged enough people to understand how severe the consequences could be for making mistakes, and yet he died believing that there were reasons for hope if we could muster our many resources to create truly caring communities. Hope can be found, and it lies in the self-advocacy movement, which is led by cognitively and developmentally disabled people who know what a better world can and should look like. They should have our support. They should have the reins. But it is unclear if we want that. It seems instead that we were willing to dispense with large institutions only when it became evident that society could act as one. Instead, fully imbued with institutional thinking about the cognitively and developmentally disabled people in our communities. With unimaginable resources to spare, we withhold, relying on long outdated ideas like segregated special education, which 7 million disabled children receive in some form today. We do so for reasons that have little to do with equal provision for them and everything to do with the convenience of upholding the prejudices of the parents of non-disabled children and their vain, cosmetic conception of what an American classroom and American society should look like. When faced with a similarly dire outlook in 1887, Walter Fernald moved forward by looking back, poring over the work of all those who had come before him, all those who attempted to see the real possibility where others saw only hopelessness, and he used that repository of knowledge to cast off what did not work and to try, with success and failure alike, to move us from a world of idiots, imbeciles, unimprovables, and morons, the feeble-minded, to something better, if only we can find the will to do the same. So, I would be happy to take some questions. I'm grateful to you for listening to all of that. I'll need some help from our tech crew of how to look for questions in the chat, but I'm happy to do that, or maybe I can take them from someone on the team. But if folks have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. I'm happy to take questions. For those of you online, you can email me at my email address. I use my Kennedy School address as the catch-all sort of one, so you can find that on my faculty page. But you've been very, very gracious to take an hour to listen to all of this, and I hope you'll find useful things in the book, and grateful for your time. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Alex, thank you for fighting, and thank you for the research that you're doing, for all the work that you're doing. It's urgent, it's important, it's critical now more than ever. Thank you.